I'd like to welcome you to the 6th Azim Premji University Public Lecture. I'm Chandan Gowda, faculty at the Azim Premji University, APU from now on. In keeping with APU's belief that the advancement of knowledge and the advancement of social justice are conjoined pursuits, the APU Public Lecture Series invites lectures by individuals who have expanded creative possibilities for furthering practices of social, political, and economic democracy in India and elsewhere, and encourages critical discussions in the public. We are honored that Professor Bruno Latour, one of the foremost philosophers and sociologists of science, is delivering the lecture this evening. Latour is presently professor at Sciences Po, Paris. His efforts towards overcoming the divide between the social and the natural sciences, a divide which is argued is a post-Enlightenment intellectual development, are driven by democratic as much as academic motivations. Many of his books, including Laboratory Life, Science in Action, The Pasteurization of France, We Have Never Been Modern, Science Reassembling the Social, and more recently Politics of Nature, have not only tried to show that domains of scientific activity and indeed any other intellectual activity are enmeshed with socio-material processes, but have also aspired, to use his own phrase, to bring the sciences into democracy. In re-theorizing materiality and recasting the methods of social and scientific research investigations, Professor Latour has attempted to advance a genuine recognition of the ontological plurality of life worlds. I'm also pleased to note the presence of your Ananthamurthy in the audience. Parts of his novel Bharatipura have been the subject of extended discussion in a chapter in Latour's book, Pandora's Hope, Essays in the Reality of Science Studies. Professor Latour's lecture this evening is entitled Ecological Crises, Digital Humanities, and New Political Assemblies. I invite Professor Latour to give his address. Thank you.
And I had the very embarrassing situation that some of the audience yesterday said they will attend to this lecture today. Unfortunately, there was some overlap between the two lectures, and I didn't want to bore the people who had been yesterday with a repeat, especially because one of you yesterday said that I have a tendency to repeat myself, even though she said that in a nice way, that is, you need to get always more. I decided to, since it's a holiday, to do something much more informal. So there will be no slides, no fireworks, no pedagogical things, especially also because I was told that for people to come to a holiday, at a holiday season to lecture means that they are sort of the crème de la crème, as you say in English, and thus there was no reason to do any pedagogical thing. So I will do not a difficult talk, but I will talk about something which I have never talked about, which is the current program I'm now engaged, which is this inquiry into modes of existence. The reason why I think it would be interesting to pick up your brain about it is that, as you will see, it's also an experiment in digital humanities, which will start in earnest in a year. And I really hope that lots of Indian colleagues might be interested to participate in this digital humanity experiment. So let me explain first what I mean by the project, which is called An Inquiry into Modes of Existence. It starts from, I've been doing it for 30 years, so it's a long process, but my talk will not be that long. It is about picking up from the work I did called We Have Never Been Modern, which was itself a consequence of the work we have been doing in science studies about the practice of science, as you were reminded of a minute ago. The work of science that we were doing on science, the practice of science, showed that the so-called West was actually inheriting a completely different history than the one which had been presented to the world with the theme of modernization. To inherit from the modernizing project after the revision of history of science by the people in my field, historian of science, is not the same at all as to inherit from the traditional view of science. So there's a big gap between the history of science before and after science studies. I'm, of course, biased in favor of my little field, but that is a consequence anthropologically. And it's this consequence which I drew in this work, We Have Never Been Modern. But as the expression of the book says, it's a negative definition. We, meaning us, which means largely you, have never been modern, doesn't say anything on what was the content of the experience, of the experiment, which had been going on under the word modernizing. So I've been engaged into this search for an anthropology of the basic set of values, if you want to say in this way, which have been extant in the narrative of the West. I will use this expression, which is very loose, and maybe we will be able to define it afterward, in contradiction with the practice. In other words, what I discovered by studying science is that there were almost no relation between the value of science, the way it was practiced by the scientists I was studying, very good scientists, and the narrative which was given by the philosophy of science, where science was endowed with all sorts of virtues and values about morality, order, political organization, and so on. So my first fieldwork, my second fieldwork, I started in Africa actually many years ago, my second fieldwork in science showed me that this disconnect between the practice and the sort of public or ideology of science had to be taken into account, which in the book I wrote, We Have Never Been Modern, I sort of coded by saying that's the difference between a sort of process of purification, where the West presents itself as those who have finally distinguished between the world of fact and the world of values, the world of materiality and the world of spirituality, the world of objectivity and the world of subjectivity. That's the official discourse, purification. And then when you study laboratories, when you follow scientists at work, when you document the development of science and technology, you have another narrative which is entirely different, which is, on the contrary, the integration at an ever larger scale and at an ever larger intimacy between facts and values. So you have two completely different narratives to understand the so-called modernization. An official narrative, which says modernizing means that we finally make a distinction between fact and value. We abandon the gods behind us. We move on. We are actually following a modernizing front. And here in India, you know a lot about this narrative. And there is, of course, the other one, what I think is the real, practical, at least following the practice narrative, of an integration at an expanded scale of a connection between fact and value. So this is why I was writing We Have Never Been Modern and Politics of Nature. How come that the same people, the same collective, the same civilization can live with two completely different definitions of themselves? One that they project outside, including India, China, Africa, which is to say, we are the one who have finally divided fact and value, and a practice which is doing the opposite at a level of the earth. How do we know that these narratives are disconnected? Largely from history of science. I'll give you just one example coming from the work of Simon Schaffer, the great historian of science from Cambridge, on Newton's gravity, because gravity is, of course, an interesting element. He studied how did Newton, the great Newton of physics, the hero of physics, try to understand the transportation of the instantaneous effect of gravitation. And Newton, as you know, was also a theologian, although a very unorthodox one. And he was trying to understand how this gravitation force could have an influence at an infinite speed, immediacy from distant bodies. And as Simon Schaffer has shown, he wrote 1,000 pages of a discipline which you probably don't know, even though in India you might know about it, called Angelology, the science of angels. Because he found that in the theological tradition, angels were the one able to transport the forces fast enough. So it's the only entity that he could find were angels. And then, of course, in the successive drafts, the angels lost their wings, so to speak, and they became forces. But in Newtonian forces, there is actually the angels sort of subliminally there. And you could make the same argument, which has been also made by great historian James Sickard, about Darwin's conception of adaptation, which is strongly, contrary to what people say, fused with the religious argument of an order of nature and natural theology. Never would have Darwin invented the notion of adaptation without this idea coming from natural theology. And I could go on and on like this. Every single moment of science has two different narratives. One of them is, finally, science takes us out of the archaic past and obeys the front of modernization, and another version of science where it says, on the contrary, we are mixing together entities of different status and trying to make something which I call a collective. Anthropologically, it doesn't have the same meaning, as I said, of inheriting from the narrative of emancipation and modernization and inheriting from the narrative of involvement, implication, and attachment. Okay, this is the moment where I was. But now the question is, okay, if this is true, and you would admit that it might be true just for the sake of the argument, how can we now study positively this time the values in practice with which the one who said we are going to modernize the planet are actually acted by? So the word which I use here is a word which probably none of you use in this sense, the word mode of existence, which is a very common expression which has been used by a French philosopher of technology called Simondon. Some of you might have heard du mode d'existence des objets techniques, which is a book which I think has been translated in English recently, and a book you never heard of by a philosopher you will never have heard of from the 1930s called Etienne Souriau, who wrote a book on the different modes of existence. This expression will strike a chord in an Indian audience, and that's why I was interested in talking to you about this project. Because the argument is that when we study the way in which the so-called West has understood entities, it's not true that contrary to what happened from the 17th century to the end of the 20th century, there are only two sorts of entities, the so-called objective entity and the so-called subjective entities, which is the traditional ways in which the modern see themselves. We are the one, again, that have made finally the distinction. In practice, and practice is very important, they, the former we, which is the different others, entertain completely different version, completely different definition of their entities. So this is where the word mode of existence has to be taken seriously. How many ways for a sort of normal Westerner are they to entertain the multiplicity of entities? Now that's where the thing is interesting in an Indian context, because the traditional way of understanding the Western modernizing urge is to say, and to code it as naturalism. The problem that, as I said with the example, very brief example I took from history of science, naturalism is a very bad definition of what scientists do. So naturalism doesn't, the idea that the Westerner, the modern, actually in a natural world doesn't carry what the West is about. Naturalism, that's a complicated argument, but I summarize, naturalism, the West is not in nature. Nature is not the characteristics of the Western urge. Something else is at work. Something which is very difficult to capture because there is very little anthropology of the so-called modern. Anthropology and lots of post-colonial study here in India have shown that very nicely. Anthropology is the way the modernizing see the other, but it's a very strange anthropology, a very asymmetric anthropology, because it supposes that we have been modern and that the we study the other who are non-modern or in the process of modernizing. And that has paralyzed anthropology from the start, because then the we here has seen the other as having a culture or a civilization. And we, strangely enough, had a culture, a civilization, plus a nature, which was very odd. We had the privilege of having a culture plus nature, not a nature. Nature with a capital N. And I'm sorry to say that you guys had only a culture, which is great, respectful. We learn to be very polite with you. We respect cultures. There are many cultures. They have to be respected, but they are respected as representation of something which nature is. So it's a strange respect. This is a very anthropology of a traditional mood is a sort of strange entity. It's very respectful. It learned to be very respectful of cultures, except cultures where a multiplicity which was only based on representation, not on ontology, not on what entities are really. Whereas those who were doing the anthropology had the advantage of having simultaneously a culture, everyone agrees with that. The Brits are very bizarre, everyone can do the anthropology of the Brits and the French and so on and so forth, but they had nature in addition. And what anthropologically was nature is a great mystery. What is this strange way of organizing nature? So nature is not, if you now understand the argument, nature is not the hidden, uncoded point of view out of which we see the culture, multiple cultures, but a mystery, an anthropological mystery. Who anthropologically are these people who have simultaneously multiple cultures and one nature? And in order to do so, it's an important, it's a difficult position for to be in this anthropological tradition, because you see everywhere cultures which are just representation. They don't have ontological weight. They don't carry what the word is like. They carry only representation of one word on which we, the anthropologists, have the double advantage of seeing simultaneously cultures as a multiple and nature as a unity. Okay? Well, if you don't agree, we will see in the discussion. The problem with this view is that it attributes a definition of nature which is not carried out by practice, and it obliges those who criticize to be limited to a culture. I mean, this is a quandary of lots of post-colonial studies. It's very difficult to fight back without taking up a large part of the Western definition of a divide. On this divide, we now have a good history. It starts somewhere in the 17th century with Locke, Galileo, then Locke, then etc. It goes on like this, where the divide has been into what is called primary and secondary qualities, and it has been constantly rediscovered and re-entrenched by the tradition of philosophy. That is, the divide between, on the one hand, let's say, objectivity and the other one, subjectivity. Unfortunately, the humans, this is how the bifurcation goes on, we have no access to realities. We only have access to subjective vision of reality, values, colors, touch. The reality, the primary quality, this is the word which is used in philosophy, escape us and is known only for science, science which is itself completely off practice. So the difficulty of that argument is that it has a very, very, very strange political consequence. And here I'm in the title of a new political assemblies. The argument is that when you use the notion of nature, you do organize a polity. You actually accept to organize a way of making agreement possible. Because you would say, we are divided by our secondary quality, our subjective views, our ideologies, our religion, which are representation, and they are multiple. But we are united as far as the primary quality are concerned. The primary quality are real. They are the stuff out of which the world is made. Unfortunately, they have no values. This is unfortunate. Lots of scientists have said in the 20th century, but that's the way it is. The world is made of stuff which is not visible, which is not accessible to the senses, but which is known by science, science capital S, and which has no value, except the value of knowledge. Values is something we add to the reality, but it has no ontology. The great philosopher Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote in the interwar period, a great book called Process and Reality, made quite a fun of that situation by saying, we, the Westerner, are supposed to live in a world where we have a choice between a real world which has no value and value which have no reality. And he said, the nightingale sing, but the song of the nightingale has no connection with the nightingale, because the nightingale real song is known by a science which has no value. So our experience to hear the nightingale and relate it to the real nightingale is actually wrong, says the bifurcator. So the modernist is a strange animal. I mean, no, sorry, it's not an animal. It's a strange anthropos. The one whose experience is divided between a reality which has no value and value which have no reality, which is very odd. But that's the official representation. What about the real practice in which the moderns, let's use this word with a capital, have been engaged? So what I began to work on is a set of inquiries. People sometimes complain and say, we never know what you are studying because sometimes you write a book on law and sometimes on science and sometimes on economics, etc. But in fact, the reason is that I'm listing the different sets of values on which an anthropology of a Westerner could be founded. Okay, so the idea is to say, if we were doing the anthropology of, let's say, another culture, we will consider as essential the core of that culture. Religion, economy, rituals, exchange, land use, etc. But when we go to the West and we want to do the anthropology, we are studying only the margins of that cultures. Anthropologically, we will not study science, technology, economy, law. So the project of doing an anthropology of a modern is to say, if I want to do an anthropology, I have to study the heart of what makes up this culture, or this collective, as well. Science, technology, economics, religion, law. Now, this is difficult, because the West say, we are beyond the gods. We are secular. So we cannot study us because we are secular, which is strange, because of course we have lots of gods, but they are difficult to study. They say, we have a science, but the science is completely different from the epistemology of science. They say we have an economy. Actually, they have been very successful in making the whole world believe that economy is actually nature. It's natural. But in fact, it's very difficult to study how economics as a discipline extend and expand, and so on and so forth. Because of this double discourse that the Westerners have, we have been modern, we have done exactly the opposite. Every time you begin to study a topic, you are taken by the sort of double bind. Are you studying the official version, or are you studying the practice? So I decided to study rather systematically, I have to say, for 25 years, those set of practices, the total of which, in my view, make up for a fairly good rendering of what the modern have been in reality. I mean, this is the hypothesis. So, the mode of existence argument is to say, and that's the hypothesis, that the Westerner entertain in practice quite a few different truth conditions. That is, if you want to use the example of speech act theory, which has been devised by Searle and the others, Austin and then Searle, it's a bit like that. Austin and Searle have shown that there are, when we listen to talk, there are different ways in which, and that's their word, we code for the felicity and infelicity condition. We don't have one felicity and infelicity condition. We have several. Order, command, begging, wishing, all of that is different. And Austin and Searle tried to make the speech act theory about that. Well, use that as a metaphor to understand what I'm going to say now. The hypothesis is that we entertain in the Western tradition quite a few different types of felicity and infelicity condition. A good example is law. Some of you here are lawyers. When someone who is not a lawyer faces a lawyer, there is always a great surprise, because no one understands what the lawyers do. It's very surprising. And yet, it's clear that it has a truth condition which is specific to law. And the adverb, legally, has a meaning, obviously, for the lawyers, which is very difficult to translate for those who are not lawyers. But clearly, there is a legal definition of truth condition, which is very different from, for instance, scientific truth condition. Immediately when you enter a legal situation, people begin to say, yes, but legally it doesn't work. Legally. So legally is an adverb that carries, and that's where the argument goes, a mode of existence which has specific felicity and infelicity condition. And I did a book on a very boring part of French law, administrative law, most boring part of law. And the lawyer I've studied, it took me 5 years to study it because it's very, very, very boring and very technical. And they were constantly using an expression in French, moyen, means of, we had trouble for the English translation, legal means. What does legal means mean? They were using it 10 times a day, and it's not even in the dictionary, so obvious it is. And it's very, very different from any other thing that people entertain. So you can be convinced that you're right, but legally you're wrong. And to be legally wrong is not superposable to is psychologically right. So you might, and that's a shock between two truth conditions, which is highly easy to detect, very difficult to define. So in my project, I opened a whole set of archives to detect all the category mistakes in which you would take something psychologically or something legally. Okay? So you would say, that's very unfair because it's not, I don't feel that I've been convinced by the judge, and the judge says, sorry, but legally, that's the end. You have no, how do you say that? You have no other appeal possible. It's finished. Is it true scientifically? No lawyer will say true scientifically. They say they would true legally. And in Latin, they would say pro veritate habetur. What is taken for truth in law. But it's the great advantage of law is that everyone agrees that it's a respectful institution, even though it's highly specific in its definition of truth condition. Now, let's shift to science. Science is often confused in the West with information transfer. The scientists are supposed to be able, without any mediation of any sort, to produce fact. The whole of science studies, the whole of laboratory studies, there is a guy here who studies the laboratory, he would confirm what I'm saying, is opposed to that. I mean, science is, on the contrary, a highly mediated, extremely elaborated definition of slowly fact production, none of which correspond to the myth of fact just speaking for themselves. So the paradox is that when you use science in order to judge the legal truth condition, you use a shibboleth, you use a touchstone, which doesn't actually fit the scientific production. So what we did is to slowly realize that in the heart of the Western tradition, there is a culture of truth production called science, which bear no relation whatsoever with the definition of epistemology. To name this epistemology, I use the expression double click. Double click is my enemy. Really, I hate double click. This idea of unmediated access to information in a switch. You click. Which is, of course, unfair to double click because the people who really produce double click know that they need programming. But let's that aside. So if you use as a shibboleth science and say, produce me information double click, the extraordinary thing is that scientists becomes liars. Not lawyers, liars. They become people who cheat. Why? Because they have to produce the data. We have an example of that. During the climate debate, the ClimateGate fiasco in 2009, maybe you have heard of that. It's a quite interesting episode where the extreme right, the climate deniers, hacked the files of lots of scientists in East Anglia, practicing scientists, and they put into the public view scientists exchanging emails. Everybody was very surprised because apparently scientists are supposed to produce truth without emails, without instrument, without money, without meetings, without modification and cooking of data. They are supposed to produce by revelation, coming to as if the climate was able to speak by themselves without any influences. So the surprise was extreme. Scientists need emails in order, no, the surprise is actually you need scientists to produce science. That was a great discovery. Because why people are surprised when scientists assemble and cook data and produce? Because they have a shibboleth, which is information double click. So if you begin to see now the anthropology growing, we have one set of truth condition, which is law, highly respected, obscure for everybody but lawyers, but very strong. Because when it's legally binding, it's finished inside law. Then we have science, which has no connection whatsoever with information double click, but which has been produced as a quality. What about religion? Well, that's a tricky thing in the West, because the West believe they are secular, which is very odd. They believe they are secular, and they are here constantly hesitating how to judge with which shibboleth, judge with which touchstone, judge the quality of a truth condition of religious discourse. If you use double-click, all religion is just lies, because it's made of lots of stuff, strange things, miracles, gods, divinities, etc. Now, if you want to listen to religion, and here I will use only the one most developed in the Western tradition, that is Christianity, the way in which religious truth is being able to speak is highly specific, but very, very difficult to understand in a right key if you listen to it using the legal key, the scientific key, or double-click key. If you want to listen in the right key to what religion, Christian religion at least, has been speaking, it's a strange way of truth condition which has as its condition that it should convert the life of those who hear it. If you speak in the way that is transforming the person you address, then in the tradition of Christianity, that's what religious truth is about. This is the first Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Logos. If you can speak in a way that converts those who speak, you speak, great. But you see that this truth condition is extraordinarily different from law, extraordinarily different from science, extraordinarily different from double-click. I'm not going to go all of them, but you begin to see that the Westerners are interesting. Contrary. They are themselves desperate. They say we have lost the gods, we have lost nature, we are just modernizing, we are secular, we have done terrible things to the environment, we have done atrocious things in India, we have exploited all the public. So they feel sort of terrified by their own sin. But in fact, the key thing is that they are interesting. They are amazingly interesting anthropologically because they are so bizarre. They ignore the values which they have developed because they apply to their own anthropology a narrative which has no relation with their practice, which no other civilization, no other culture ever had. I mean, actually, all the other cultures tried to be as close from practice as possible, but the Westerners have ignored that magnificently for interesting reasons which I have no time to get in. But you begin to see that they are interesting because they, in fact, in practice, entertain several truth conditions which are incommensurable. So it's not true to say that the Westerner, in their modernizing urge, have only one definition of themselves, which they try to extend to the rest of the world. Let's take politics. What is there a truth condition, a felicity and infelicity condition of politics? Most political scientists would say, no. I mean, bringing truth into politics is not a thing to do. Politics is about lying. Machiavellically lying well. Well, but lying well is a difficult job. So is there actually a specific felicity? When I say specific, you have to take it very seriously. It's as specific as it is. I mean, if law is specific, if religion is specific, if science is specific, it means that the whole regime of truth condition has to be taken into account. It's not just representation of slight adjustment of a truth. It's actually a complete truth condition which has to be respected and whose integrity has to be heard. Is it the same for politics? Probably. There is a whole tradition which we try to recognize the truth condition, highly specific, of politics. So, how much more minutes do I have? 10 minutes? 10? 15, okay. So the idea is to say, since the the whites are interesting. They entertain different truth conditions. It has first one great effect, is that the other are no longer other in the same way. So the whole otherness was a projection of the idea that the West had been modern. If the West begins to have a history of science, which is the one I begin to describe, if they entertain with law, with religion, with economics, I had no time to speak about economics, but it's very important, these multiple ontologies, the benchmark, the baseline to make the comparison with other cultures is completely different. In other words, otherness is itself othered. I don't know if you can use this as a verb in English. The change of the baseline on the west part is modified because the other is other in a different way. Which means what in practice? And here it's also in the title. I will manage to have the free part of the title. The title was invented by our sponsor, by the way. I had completely a different title, which was absolutely obscure, but even more obscure than what I'm now saying. So, wait. If you modify the baseline, you also modify the way for the others to be different. Before, we had been modern, and the others were being modernizing, or were not modern, or were pre-modern. Now, we have not been modern, something else completely different happened, and the others are others. They are modernizing in strange way because they sort of believe the modernity which has never occurred in our own land. So there's a big misunderstanding here on the word modernizing. Now what's happening is that suddenly the former modern and the new modernizer find themselves faced with ecological crisis. Is the ecological crisis a crisis of nature? Well, the official rendering is, yes, it's a problem of nature, but you know, we understand that nature is actually a very, very strange local category which has no connection with the practice of science and which is entertaining many other entities than one captured by the notion of nature. So the idea now, and this is where I'm trying to drag you into the project, is to begin a comparison between collectives. Collective is a word I use to replace the word society or culture. Between collectives under the aegis of what I call diplomacy. When we believe we had been modern and we were modernizing, the only otherness that was possible for the others was to be archaic or being modernized or being divided between archaic and modernity. Not a very fascinating thing to be. So this is endless discourse about India being simultaneously old and new, archaic, all this sort of ridiculous stuff. If we have never been modern, you have not been modern, you will never be modern, no one will ever be modern, we're not modernizing the planet. But we all face something which is called ecological crisis, even though the word ecology smacks too much of a tradition we might want to dispute. But what is sure is that we have to entertain something which is a negotiation on the number of entities and the type of entities which is composing the common world. The world is not common. It's not yet common. There is no way that there is a common world. But some sort of negotiation has to begin between the former modern and the former modernized, if I could say that. So diplomacy is the word that I use in a situation where there is no common arbiter. Diplomacy is the word of people who have fought. There has been a fight, a war. They realize there is no way to win the war and that there is no arbiter. Then they have to begin negotiating. My interpretation of the situation in ecological crisis is exactly that. That is, we are in a situation when the former arbiter, the state, God, market, or nature are not there. There is no arbiter to allocate this dispute. Ecology is not about nature. The great mistake, as I showed in Politics of Nature, of ecological thought is to believe that it's about the defense of nature, as if it was a way of allocating the nature. We don't need politics because we have nature. We should defend nature, end of politics. The agreement will be done. We'll agree since nature makes us agree. This is impossible. That will be believing in the arbiter. If there is no arbiter, no referee, we have to negotiate. But in order to negotiate, in order to assemble, it's the title, Political Assemblies. I just 5 more minutes and I will get the digital humanities part of the title. No relation with the abstract, but at least with the title. The political assembly is a diplomatic assembly. But wait, it's a diplomatic assembly only if those who assemble come with the beings, the modes of existence, the entities, the divinities with which they are actually attached. If you say, if we talk about nature, we leave aside all the other entities because obviously we are all assembling in a secular setup. This is not diplomacy, this is war. If you say, well, we assembled, but of course we share the values of economic and we all agree that economic theory is the only way to calculate the odds and the good and the bad. This is not diplomacy, this is war, because you impose precisely the thing which should be negotiated. So the very interesting definition of diplomacy is that the diplomat is the one who comes sent by people who are tired of war and fight, but who are not exactly sure of what is their attachment. It's not the same thing to defend science as it's known by science studies or defend science as it's known by epistemology. It's not the same thing to defend politics as the mode of existence I had no time to describe in detail, or to say politics is obviously about universal rights and democracy. In one case, the universality is not yet done. In the other, is already done, and prematurely done. Okay? Last part of the title, Digital Humanities. I've written I've done this study for 27 years now, trying to figure out the various modes of existence which give of the former West what I consider as a sort of fair reading. And I'm publishing a book which is a sort of summary of where I am. But then in the meantime arrived the digital world, and I thought it would be a good idea to organize the inquiry with other people. That is, I published the book, Harvard will publish it next year, but the book is just my version of what I just briefly indicated in this talk. And we are and then I wrote a grant application to the EU to do this mad project, and I was sure of not getting the money, so I made the project completely mad, and I got the money. So now I have to do the job, which is to imagine that readers of a book could actually become co-inquirers into the work. That is, people interested, for instance, in the contrast between law and science would be attuned to what I say about the two truth condition and would propose on this platform that we are building now, counter example or example to corroborate it and say, I have much better example than the one you mentioned that, or I have other example and I want to add them to the platform and so on and so forth. So that in 3 years, we would have an expanded, much better, accurate reading of all these conflicts of values which define in this understanding the collective anthropology. And of course, the diplomacy would be much easier to make, because then we would have much more data coming from lots of other different people about the different set of values which are in conflict. Okay? So we will have a platform that would allow people interested here, for instance, to propose other data, or data is not exactly the word, proposition of documents. And then at the end of a project, using this digital platform, I have nothing to show you yet, because all of that is work in process, we will republish the book, which will include the end of the the provisional end of the diplomacy, where people would sort of argue that the experience I pointed out might be okay, but the rendering I propose completely ridiculous. And this is another version. So we would actually try to feed our way. If I say secularization, we'll try to have another definition of secularization, which would have been produced by many more people and thus much more accurate. Diplomacy, by definition, is not a work which can be done alone. So it's a mixture of philosophy, anthropology, and diplomacy mediated by a digital interface. I'm sorry I have nothing to show you of this interface, which would have been interesting, and actually I'd like to see how it looks like. But I have a team working now in Paris. I hope they made some progress while I was here in Bangalore. This is about what I wanted to say as a sort of introduction to the mode of existence project. I thought it would be a better entry into the discussion, which can now start. Thank you very much for your patience. I don't hear you.
In a lighter vein, the abstract I got from Sciences had all those phrases that you felt that I had put on there. Anyway, we have time for half an hour of questions.
Those who engage in diplomacy have the wars as the breakdown options. So the diplomacy is shaped by the breakdown options.
Is shaped by?
Shaped by the breakdown option, and war is a breakdown option. So what is the war? What is imposed? When China says that no, we cannot devalue the currency, that can be the war. It's not what the theory says. So the war at a particular context can be dictated by certain other structures out there and not necessarily the knowledge packs in the West or in certain specific contexts. So in that sense, those who are engaging in diplomacy are interested in shaping comfortable breakdown options. We don't want certain wars, but we can tolerate certain other kinds of wars. So the question is that now, even when we are engaging in diplomacy, we may be interested in shaping certain wars as the breakdown options, because we don't like certain other kinds of wars.
I'm not completely sure I understand it's always dangerous to use the metaphor of war. I take it anthropology, as it has been shown by many post-colonial critique, was in a way a set of war in my sense, because it supposed a referee. So war is what happens when there is no referee and the thing has to be allocated by fight. If you have a war which is held under a referee, it's called a police action. It's not a war. When you are an economist, right? So if we have an allocation of resources which is considered as possible with the referee, the arbiter of, let's say, economic theory, in my view, it's not a war. It's a police operation. You know that there is a referee doing the allocation. If there is no referee, then it's a war. Nature, when we say the ecological crisis is a question of nature known by science, and once we know nature, politics is not necessary because we can allocate resources and know what to do, this is a police operation. Because there is an arbiter, a referee. This is my definition. When there is an ecological crisis, when there is no arbiter and no referee, which is, in my view, the case in every single of these events, then there is a war. So it might be a sort of, it's a war about the world. It's a war about the composition of the world. And the big difference is, can we accept, and that's where the notion of democracy will come in, can we accept to settle those ecological disputes without referee? And that's where the diplomat, so maybe I'm using, you're right, I might use the word in a special sense, but that's a way to define them. And when is it, what it is to handle the ecological crisis without nature as an arbiter. That's what I'm really interested. And that's where all the sort of, it seems to me, the excitation of so much political ecology is coming from. Because that's precisely, once you have used the word, the needs of nature, politics doesn't stop, politics starts. And that's where things become interesting.
Professor Latour, let me try and formulate my question so that it's clear to you. In the first part of your talk, when you talk about the value-laden scientific enterprise, in some sense, the critiques of science, when you talked about the right-wing hackers into the emails of scientists, isn't the general public always imputing a kind of a Baconian notion of science, that science is like an engine of discovery, so to speak, which scientists themselves never hold on to? In fact, it is a network of emailing and inquiries and paradigms and counter paradigms. But in the end, don't you think that there is the possibility of constructing narratives, if you will, but narratives nonetheless that have a predictive power, that can describe scientific truths, just as you talk about legal truths. And so if that is the case, if there is a predictability aspect to it.
There is what?
Predictability, that it can predict. You know, it is a model, nonetheless, that describes nature out there, but it has predictive power. So then is it not possible to generate in this context facts that are divorced from value? I'd like your opinion on this.
Well, this is a question coming from a physicist, so it has to be taken with great care. Well, the argument has nothing with a critique of science, okay? It is absolutely not a critical point. It's to say, in the climate gate, it was very surprising for people outside science, let's say positivist version of science, to realize that you needed, what you say is completely obvious for all scientists, that is, you need network of practicing scientists in order to build these models of reality that you allude to. So there's nothing surprising for the practicing scientists there. The problem is that the scientists themselves in this tradition I was mentioning are completely separated between the practice and the official epistemology. And that's where the problem is. So the value of science, what is the value of science? The truth condition of science is very difficult to actually detect. That's why the comparison with law is so interesting. Because when you compare with law, everyone agrees that law is linked to an institution, a specific institution that you need tribunal, lawyers, money, case, and lots of things. But it's much more difficult to house, to welcome the truth condition of science that you mentioned, which have to be respected, in the notion of an institution necessary to produce a fact. I mentioned to the student in the workshop I was doing this anecdote where a great climatologist of the Collège de France in France said he was accused of believing in climate change. And he said this is not a question of belief, it's a question of respecting the institution of science. And I wanted to tell him that when did you defend science as an institution to be respected? And that's the problem. That's where I agree entirely with you about the possibility of a narrative in which the values of the truth condition of science would be respected. But it's very difficult to do that with the traditional argument where the institution of science, the scientists, their instrument, their money flow have disappeared. And that's especially the case in climate dispute now. It's fact about the anthropic origin of global warming. There is a disconnect between the value of the truth condition of science and the institution, the public representation of the institution of science. That's why the law is interesting. But it's exactly, of course, the sort of thing, what you pointed out, exactly the sort of thing I'm interested in. Even though that's where the platform I'm inventing would be interesting, because then you could say, Monsieur Latour, I agree with your description of a practice of science, but your rendering smacks of relativism. And I want my science to be, my physics to be respected in my own terms. And then we begin the negotiation. If your own terms is to say, let's separate science from politics and fact from value, I would say, wait. I mean, you cannot do that, because then look at what happened to the climatologists. They are completely taken in these things. And that's where the diplomacy begins, which is to find, and then we republish my own version of, if you agree to participate. 3 years later, we republish and say, okay, Latour is very good at describing a scientific practice, but his philosophy is terrible. His way of phrasing makes every scientist just up in arms, and they get their gun and say this is relativism, et cetera, et cetera. But the experience, that's the way it is. There's no, so that's where the negotiation becomes really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for an anthropology of the West, finally. I have two questions. Basically, you said the truth conditions of law, religion, and science were incommensurable at some level. Is it possible to see that at maybe at a more general level?
You have to speak in the mic, if not, I don't hear you.
Okay. At a more general level, they're not so incommensurable after all, because if you see what undergirds all of them seems to be some kind of a positive conception of truth, where the value of truth is essentially cognitive. It's tested. It has, in all three cases, it takes the shape of evidence and propositions, which then are tested true or false. So is there something common there, I'm wondering, and which binds these apparently incommensurable truths together. So that's question one. The second question is, I was wondering if then there is some form of reasoning that seems to be common to all of them, how would you respond to, say, philosophers like John McDowell, who say then if reason is a faculty, then natural science cannot study it. It's in the realm of human sciences. And therefore he posits this idea of second nature. So I was wondering how you would...
I didn't get the second question.
The second one.
Yeah.
No, the second one is if what undergirds all these forms, these different kinds of what you said, truths or truth conditions, if what undergirds them is a form of reasoning, right? Now, there are certain philosophers like John McDowell who say that this form of reasoning, reason is a faculty which cannot be studied by natural sciences at all, but is in the realm of the human sciences. So, therefore, McDowell goes on to posit this idea of second nature, which is initiation into space of reasons or something like that. So, I was wondering how would you respond to these two questions?
They are not easy. First, I have 14 of those modes, 15 even with double click. So I just pointed a few. I need 14 to get sort of a good description. So I've not elaborated because it would have been too long. But the first question is very interesting because precisely they are not cognitive. The meta-language, to move from all the others, is not cognitive. And that's where the word category is different, because in the philosophical tradition until William James, that the only meta-language to compare those reasoning was cognitive. Actually, the very notion of category since Aristotle, at least in our tradition, was cognitive. But that's not the case with those. The religious truth condition I mentioned is not cognitive at all. I mean, speaking in the way that modifies the character, resuscitate those you talk to, there's nothing cognitive about it. So what I'm using here is the great innovation of William James in philosophy, which is he used the word preposition actually to talk about these. So they are not, cognition is precisely one very bad rendering of what scientific practice is about. And that's, of course, a huge critical position. It's a huge difference with analytical philosophy and so on. Now, the second question is, which is about reason, if I understood right. My argument is that we inherit the notion of reason, and here there is a connection with my earlier work on actor network, because following the threads of a network, following the thread is what I would call reason. To be a rationalist is not, of course, believing in the double click, but following the different threads is what I would call reason. But of course, the threads, following all these 15 different threads, is very, very different from a rationalistic tradition. But still, it's about reason. I agree with you. But reason has been kidnapped by a very, very narrow definition of the natural, with which this argument is entirely in conflict with. And that's also why in the word mode of existence, there is the notion of the multiplicity of ontologies. We are in each of these modes, according to the definition, in connection with beings, entities, which have certain characteristics. And I didn't have much time to go into that because that would look really strange. And the metaphor of speech act will just dissolve. But the idea is that, contrary to their own representation of themselves, the former modern are actually entertaining multi-realist argument. Not multicultural argument, multi-natural argument. Multinaturalism is at the heart of this argument. Even though officially, in their own self-representation, they entertain multiculturalism, but mono-naturalism. But that's the official version. In practice, I think it's different. These are two very important questions. I can only give a very short answer to them.
Dr. Latour, here.
Sorry.
I was I was wondering, it's connected to Shashi's question just earlier. I was wondering if you see your critique, if you see in your critique resonances with someone like Gandhi's critique of the law, which also sort of moves from what she's calling a cognitive idea of truth to truth as a mode of living, right? Which at least I see a resonance with what you're saying, where truth becomes satyagraha, which is a mode of living, and in such a mode of living, and it's also interesting when you talked about diplomacy, because Gandhi is again a figure that's sometimes called a shrewd diplomat, and I think there are resonances with what you're calling diplomacy and what he forges as a mode of living, as a critique of the cognitive idea of truth. And this is something I'm borrowing from Akhil Bilgrami's work on Gandhi. So I was wondering if you saw resonances with Gandhi's work, and particularly that idea of a mode of living that he forges in his...
Well, I'd love to be able to say that I'm an honorary Gandhist, but it means that I would need to know more about Gandhi, which is not the case. Unfortunately, I read a terrible biography of him, which I bought at this sanctuary in Delhi, and that didn't enlighten me. I should have read the one you mentioned here. Mode of living, the problem is I'm slightly worried about the expression mode of living if it's by contrast with the cognitive, because it smacks for me, maybe I'm wrong, of a usual bifurcation between knowledge and life, when the whole enterprise I'm trying to push is precisely to be multiple and to count beyond two. Philosophy would make an enormous progress in the West if it were able to count beyond two. And three, if you want to add dialectic, except three is actually a mixture of the two. So I try to count until 15. And 15 is an enormous progress compared to two. And if we could entertain 15 different types of entities, the difference between mode of living and cognition will sort of be blurred, so to speak, because a law as a mode of existence is as different from religion as a mode of existence as religion is from science, and it is from double-click, as it is from the one which is dearest to my heart, and probably to a lot of the activity in India here. This is in the great novel by Bhagavad here, which is Divinities, which in the Western tradition has become psychology, but which in your tradition, of course, has been entertained very differently. So living, if it's not the other part of cognition, is fine. That's precisely why I use mode of existence to avoid the word living, which has a long, long history in the Western tradition of opposition with cognition. And I think we'll go nowhere with this opposition, which will just reproduce the difference, the bifurcation of nature, to use the expression I did before. But I'd love to know more about Gandhi's diplomacy, though.
Professor, you are focusing on anthropological perspective.
Right.
My question is brief. Does the anthropological perspective help decipher the true nature of people?
Help what?
I'll repeat. Does the anthropological perspective help decipher the true nature of people?
Yes. That's what we are about. Yes. We want to find, I mean, nature might be true and people, free words might be a bit disputable, but the answer is yes. What anthropology will not be worth a minute of our interest if it was not about the true nature. Of course, the paradox is that anthropology, as in its etymology, the word anthropos, the human, and most of it, anthropological literature, is about the numbers of entities with which the human is actually entertaining relations. And what I'm doing in the anthropology of the modern is just how many other entities are actually accompanying and attached to the humans in the Western tradition, when they say they have no attachment. So to your question, I would say really yes.
I was trying to understand what you meant by diplomacy,
Yeah?
and would like to just put an interpretation that you can comment on, that perhaps it is in another more authentic word for modern, in the sense that what modernity originally fought for, if you look back to the 16th century, was the autonomy and freedom of the individual will.
Was what?
The autonomy and freedom of the individual will, to free it from feudalism and traditional dogma imposed by corrupt institutions, etc. And the problem came up when reason was used to justify that, because everyone could reason, therefore everyone could be free. But the problem is when reason became an end, a goal, rather than just an argument for it. So that created the dilemma that the social contract tried to resolve, saying that how can we have a rational truth that everyone believes in, and at the same time, how can everyone be free? And the social contract proposes that you have to give up a certain degree of freedom to resolve that problem. But in your notion of diplomacy, saying that we must sort of structure basis for negotiating basic terms, perhaps one is going back to that original claim for freedom before it became equated with reason. Because when the problem becomes rational, it's seen as a technical problem. So then technical problems, you tend to discuss means and you tend to forget ends. So you're saying we can't forget that, and we must always negotiate, continually negotiate ends also. So perhaps that's really a more authentic notion of modern.
Yes, well, Ulrich Beck proposed the word second modernization. So, but the reason why I was, this is the problem of emancipation. This is what actually led me to the novel by Anna Murty, and which has actually been played by a host, because maybe not everyone knows that he was actually playing the hero of this novel. Here we have a novelist and the actor in the film who played this extraordinary character of Jagannath in the novel, which is precisely exploring this, exactly your question, which is the moment when the borrowed definition of freedom enters into conflict not with archaism, and that's a great novelty for me of a novel, but precisely with something which means that we have misinterpreted what it was to live without attachment. So the great turn for me in this episode in the novel is precisely that it's one of the only cases, I've not found another one, where the urge for emancipation is self-analyzed as a mistake on the interpretation of what it was to have a past. So suddenly the whole thing turned around. I had the privilege of asking this question to the novelist, which is a great beauty of being in Bangalore, because it turned around this question really. How to understand the notion, how to understand emancipation, which remains, of course, something which has been invented in the century you mentioned, very important, without making mistake of what was the attachment. And there is no answer to this question, because I've explored this question in a catalogue of iconoclasts, and we have been trying to explore this question, but there's no solution to that question. But it's very important. It's there, and it's of course more important now with the ecology question. Is there a way of reinterpreting the notion of emancipation with the attachment? No one knows.
I was trying to...
It works.
Something else. Once I met Ginsberg in a meeting where they were trying to resolve a very dangerous situation. A South Korean writer was about to be arrested for a statement he made in the United States. And Ginsberg said, he took a page from me and wrote something very absurd. I said, it's very absurd. He said, no, it is not absurd. It is upaya, he said. He used the word upaya, which is a Sanskrit word. Upaya actually means now, in general usage, tactics.
It means what?
Tactics, strategy, such
strategy.
things. Something closer to diplomacy. But the original meaning was upaya, to come closer. Upaya means to come, if two people are engaged in upaya, both of them together through exchange try to come closer to whatever is the truth, upaya. It is a word used in Sanskrit for metaphor also. That's very interesting. Metaphor is the upaya, the mode of dealing with truth,
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to bring this. And I was surprised because Ginsberg wrote something very funny about the president of South Africa. And he said, if I present this, maybe he will laugh. And that is my first upaya, to make him smile.
That's the word metaphor.
I know, yes, because he wrote metaphorically something which would make that South Korean president smile. It was not haughty or condemning him or anything like that. He said, this is upaya, and we should use upaya, and I use upaya in poetry. He said. That was interesting, it has stayed in my mind. When you were talking about diplomacy, I just thought of it.
I see, okay. Tactic is a metaphor. Metaphors are tactic. Tactics, metaphoric tactics.
Yeah, has been asked in other words and answered, but I'll ask it in the words that occur to me. So when you talked about the West not being modern, there were two sort of distinct criteria that you mentioned. One was the incommensurability of the truth conditions according to law, science, and so on. And the other was the lack of registry between the narrations in each of these cases and the practice. Okay, so the first question I have is, which of these do you see as being more fundamental? Because, I mean, one could make an attempt to hierarchize these different modes of existence by saying, whatever I call the legal truth is a matter of mutual agreement, whereas what I call a scientific truth is something more fundamental and so on. I'm not proposing any particular scheme, but on the other hand, so there is in principle a way of trying to resolve this. Now, but one thing that occurs to me is that I could have thought of what it was to be modern in, all of the discussion that you presented was about notions of truth. And I could think of being modern as a way of the relative privileging of such notions of truth versus personal experience, a perception. And that didn't enter your discussion in any way. So so in that sense I could say, regardless of whatever you said, that the whole discussion is a modern,
The word modern is so has so many meanings, it's impossible to define it. That's why I've used a very different touchstone, which is the theory of science, which is embedded in it. So this is I know, modern is a word which we should not use. But the reason why I've used it, because I've defined it in We Have Never Been Modern as a very highly specific connection with the theory of science. And that I published a book in '91, I think, and that has stand the test of time. It's a good shibboleth, it's a good test. Because it's in the many different type definition of various of science, of modern, it carries something which has to do with this idealism of matter, which is at the heart of the definition of modernization. And the best thing in the definition is that it allows a study of economy as well. Because, of course, the second nature, the one of economy, is much more important than the first nature in the practice of the world now. So this is why I keep using this word modern. And then I add a majuscule, a great M, to define this tribe, which is called the moderns. But it's of course, it's a very bad definition. Now, of course, if all of that is provisional, because once we have done the diplomatic exercise, that the former modern are finally able to present themselves to the rest of the world in a non-imperialistic way, because now, this is the great news, we are a bit beaten by the BRICS. I mean, you guys, I mean, this is a great thing. I mean, it makes us more intelligent, finally. It's a great moment for us. When we believe we were terribly powerful and terribly bad, or first we believe we were terribly weak, then terribly good, then terribly bad. Finally, you are beating us with BRICS. This is great, because now we can say, okay, what happened to us? Ah, this is what has happened to us. Okay, now it's time to present finally ourselves, politely. Sorry, we presented ourselves a bit badly. We did it lots of wrong ways. Now let's try to do it again. Now, we are the ones who are defending science as practice. It's completely different from defending science as the scientific worldview. We are presenting ourselves as one having done politics in the sense. Okay, that's much more interesting. And then the conversation can begin. So then the question of allocating these 14 different modes and hierarchizing them is, it's interesting, but that's for the next stage in the diplomacy. The first thing is finally finding the whites interesting, because they are an interesting contrast anthropologically. Don't forget, this encounter is under the aegis of ecology. We are meeting Gaia. How do you and us and all of the others are going to meet the Earth as a new entity? We have absolutely no experience of that meeting. So after we have, I'm sorry to say, but after we have beaten our chest and apologizing for all the crimes of the world, before you have committed the other crimes that you will commit, the question is, okay, fine, but what about Gaia meeting? Because that's the big question. And on that, for that encounter, we have to get ready. So I see this argument about modes of existence as a way of getting ready for a calling on which all the other collectives are at a par, in a way, at a par in ignorance. We are all equally ignorant, because no civilization had to take care of meeting the Earth as a threat. So it's not archaism, it's not décroissance, it's not becoming smaller. We are not going to shrink. We are not to become small, or even though someone said that the best solution to ecological crisis is that the humans become much smaller. You know that when on island, there is this thing that animals on island become small. They are small elephant, dwarf elephant. If the Earth is an island, the idea is that then the humans become small. And of course, it solves the question. 1.5 billion of very small Indians would not consume as much resources as tall Indians. Okay, but that's metaphor. Shrinking, we cannot. So what do? We have to re-enter into negotiation about what has happened to us. What do we inherit from? Now that's what is the question. But I agree the word modern is too vague.
Again, thank you very much for a very exciting talk. It's more of a curiosity and not a well-formed question
You
yet.
have to speak into the mic.
Okay, but still more of a curiosity than a question, well-formed question yet. I wonder what does the analogy of speech act theory does to your theory or your approach of locating the truth conditions at work in different rituals of the Western kind, right? And Yeah, so that's all I want to ask, and maybe part of the negotiation that is required to look back at the analogy and what it exactly is doing to how you're understanding the Western right now. Maybe it's part of the project of the digital humanities project that you mentioned, that which you expect to come back to you with your assumptions and not challenge your assumptions, but discuss your assumptions, perhaps foreground your analogical scaffoldings. So anyhow, it's not a question really. Thank you very much.
There is no question.
There's a curiosity.
On Speech Act.
Are you aware of what exactly is the Speech Act theory analogy is doing to your understanding?
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I'm great reader of Austin. If Speech Act had led to an ontology, then you get the product in which I am. But in Speech Act, by definition, the name itself says it's a way of understanding Speech Act. But the mode of existence is, I just use it as a metaphor, as a useful metaphor, because in Speech Act we are used to the idea that there are illusory forces. That is, we begin to know how to judge what's come next if we have a key. If I say, I'm going to marry you, the key is that I am the priest or the mayor or whatever. So the notion of illusory force is a good metaphor of a mode of existence I'm studying. That is, what is before to understand in the right key what's come next. That's what I take from Speech Act theory, because it's very well known, people know about that. But of course, it's now that's where Speech Act theory will never go, which is what's the ontology accompanying that? And that's of course completely out of Speech Act theory. But you need all the resources to make this sort of makeshift argument. You need to borrow from all sorts of sources, and that's what I did.
We'll have to close the discussion now. Thanks. Thank you, Professor Latour. Thank you all for coming. There's some tea and snacks outside.